This panel, I'm Steve Savage. This panel is Sound of the Counterculture, Rock Music and Its Resistances. Music has played a part in a lot of the presentation today, as we might expect, but finally we get to put music front and center, which many of us believe is where it belongs. And I'm going to read the panel abstract. The centrality of music to the nature and experience of the counterculture is undisputed, but the ways that music accompanied and propelled diverse themes and ideas in the 60s remains a fertile area for scholarly inquiry. This panel explores key themes, places, and events in the sound of the counterculture, demonstrating how our understanding of the era continues to be shaped by the music that accompanied that time. I will add that we have some really fun papers here in which these authors are drawing some, I think in many cases, unexpected and overlooked and fascinating connections inside and outside the music of the counterculture. We're going to start by asking the three panelists to briefly introduce themselves so we get an overview of our speakers and our topics, and then they'll be presenting in the order in your program. And we will hold questions till the end after the three talks, and we'll definitely have some time for Q&A at the end. So, without further ado.
Left or right, or right to left? No, me.
In order of presentation.
Oh, in order, yeah. Hi, my name is Pat Burke. I'm a professor of music at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm working on a book about the influence of Black Power movement on 1960s rock, which is, my talk will touch on that, sort of. So that's where my interests lie.
My name is Michael Hicks. I have taught for 32 years at Brigham Young University, which I've already been spoken to about as far as propriety. I have this book, 60s Rock, Around Psychedelic and Other Satisfactions, which is a good book, but I'm not selling it here. My other credentials are this picture, Mike Bloomfield with the electric flag at the Northern California Folk Rock Festival 1968. I'm right there. 11 years old at that festival. And finally, speaking of Summer of Love, any issue of the Doors' first album in digital format since 2006 has Bruce Botnick, the producer, citing me as the reason that they speed corrected this album. So that's something. That's something. Thank you. Anyway.
I'm supposed to follow that. My name is DJ Hoek. I am the director of library collections at Northwestern University, and I am a lecturer in the Beatles School of Music also at Northwestern. My paper today looks at the somewhat complicated lines of influence and awareness between the Beatles and John Cage, neither of which were in San Francisco or that we directly associate with this anniversary. But there are definitely a lot of threads of influence and ideals that flow through my paper, and I was very pleased this morning with the presentation that Fred Turner gave, talking about the artist-scientist. This is definitely comes up, I think, in both the music of Cage and the Beatles, and then there's a few extra twists and turns thrown into my paper, which you'll hear.
Thank you, gentlemen. Patrick.
All right, great. Thank you all for coming. So the instructions were to sort of summarize my paper rather than read it. I'm going to cheat a little bit and read at least some of it, because it seems odd to summarize something that you haven't actually read, and also because I do a fair amount of direct quotation, and I want to make sure I get them right. So I will read a bit and then riff a bit as well. This is a presentation that examines the aspects of the history of two rock palaces that are probably familiar to most of you: San Francisco's Fillmore Auditorium and New York's Fillmore East. And my goal is to address the ways in which music venues represented competing ideas of community within the 1960s counterculture. So I'm going to start with a general appraisal of the communal ideals established at the original San Francisco Fillmore during the Summer of Love, much of which will probably be familiar to many of you. And then I'm going to turn my focus to a lesser-known but very dramatic 1968 incident in which a Lower East Side radical group called the Motherfuckers physically took control of the Fillmore East and attacked its impresario, Bill Graham. And I've spoken about this a few other places, and I always apologize in advance for how many times I'm going to say motherfuckers in the next 20 minutes. I feel like Lenny Bruce or something like that, but I think the crowd is used to salty language of one kind or another. This attack might seem like the antithesis of the peace and love ethos established at the San Francisco Fillmore, but I'm going to argue instead that the motherfuckers were in a certain weird, maybe misguided sense, attempting to honor that ethos by calling out the contradictions that had always underpinned it. In particular, an examination of the two Fillmores reveals that the rock community was built on a familiar countercultural conundrum. Rock depended on capitalist institutions, but those institutions were marketed as an alternative to capitalism. In considering community as my main frame of reference, I'm of course responding to the conference theme, but also to a concern ubiquitous in 1960s rock and the scholarship on it. Rock musicians and their audiences in the 60s were obsessed with the idea that rock had the power to forge and represent a countercultural community. And in his recent book, Republic of Rock, Michael Kramer, are you here, Michael? Michael is here on the 18th floor somewhere, but not here in front of us. He writes that during the 1960s, rock, quote, became a means of addressing through culture two of the core mysteries of democratic citizenship. How do disparate persons legitimately assemble into a people, and when they do, how does this affect them as individuals and a community, end quote. And today I hope to show that while those questions were central to the culture of rock, attempts to answer them were fraught with conflict that often drove disparate persons apart rather than drawing them together. So let's start here in San Francisco. Bill Graham began operating the Fillmore Auditorium at the intersection of Fillmore and Geary as a rock venue in February 1966, and kept it open until July 1968 when he moved his operation a mile away to the larger Fillmore West. Just by way of illustration, here's one of the many beautiful posters that we've all seen that were produced for the Fillmore. This one from 1967, a show featuring Big Brother and the Holding Company and the Steve Miller Blues Band. The strong sense of the Fillmore as a community space that was reported by many of its musicians and audiences was, I would argue, largely a product of Graham's policies. His bookings, for example, blurred the lines between musicians and audience. Many of the Fillmore's most regular and beloved acts lived in or near the surrounding neighborhood. And Sarah Hill argues in her book on San Francisco, quote, "The Grateful Dead and their contemporaries grew organically out of the student and dropout populations in the Bay Area, were integral members of the hate community, served that community and others through performances at places like the Fillmore," just to use the Dead as one example. In 1966, a Berkeley Barb critic praised what he called the sense of your own people on the bandstand and the vast common ground between artist and audience at the Fillmore. Immersive, disorienting light shows and loud amplifiers similarly helped to blur the boundaries between participants, creating what Richard Alpert, better known now as Ram Dass, described as a communal sense of religious ecstasy. During the Summer of Love in 1967, moreover, Graham kept the Fillmore open 6 nights a week, which made it possible for regular patrons to drop in almost any evening they liked. The Rolling Stones' Keith Richards remembered the Fillmore as, quote, "a community joint where people virtually lived." And here are some of those people in the summer of 1967. This community joint was designed to be inclusive. Much press coverage of the original Fillmore emphasized the diversity of the crowd and the surprising level of comfort that even square patrons felt there. In part, this was because Graham realized that such an atmosphere could be lucrative. He hoped to attract patrons from beyond the Haight-Ashbury, and he remembered that he was, quote, "always looking for ways to make the place more Hamish." So, for example, as you may know, he had balloons and a tub of apples in the lobby when you came in, and this was a kind of psychological thing that he figured out where if you are somebody who's kind of shy and retiring and don't know if you belong there, it gave you something to do with your hands until you could relax a little bit. Journalist Ralph J. Gleason, one of the Fillmore's most eager boosters, was 50 years old during the Summer of Love and was someone who represented a kind of bridge between hip youth and the older generation who would have read his San Francisco Chronicle column. Gleason reassured square middle-class parents that their teenage children would find a wholesome environment at the Fillmore dances, which he described as utterly harmless and a great deal of fun. Some parents, he noted, even brought their toddlers to the dances with them with no obvious ill effect on their development. The Fillmore then was a place where the counterculture could explore its most esoteric fascinations, while a less adventurous faction was welcome to participate to whatever extent they wished, while perhaps coming to understand the counterculture a little bit better. Some critics, however, noticed cracks in the Fillmores' utopian facade. For one thing, the Fillmore was in an African-American neighborhood, but its patrons were primarily white hippies of middle-class background who were contributing to the area's gentrification to some extent, creating what Charles Perry in his book on Haight-Ashbury terms a segregated bohemia. Musicologist Nadia Zimmerman points out that when Graham took over the Fillmore and replaced the R&B acts that had been playing there previously with acid rock, black residents of the neighborhood largely stopped attending. So if the community created within the Fillmore was inclusive in principle, it sometimes seemed to ignore the wider black community outside. Another concern had to do with Graham, a so-called hip capitalist who provided a valuable venue for the counterculture but was unabashed about his desire to make a profit. And here he is in a fairly typical pose with middle finger extended to the camera. By 1967, some critics had begun to argue that the Fillmore shows increasingly elevated rock stars above their audience, and that the community had become a resource to be exploited. So in the New York Times, for example, Hunter S. Thompson wrote in 1967 that people he called genuine barefoot freaked out types could no longer afford the door charge at the Fillmore, which was populated instead by borderline hippies who don't mind paying for the music and the light shows. And in a lot of these accounts, Graham's foil was the idealistic promoter Chet Helms, whose Avalon Ballroom was widely seen as a more authentic, friendly alternative to the Fillmore. Graham himself remembered, quote, "The pure hippie of the day thought of the Avalon as the real church. Mine was the commercial church," end quote. Benefits that Graham staged for such worthy local causes as the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic and the Diggers failed to fully counteract this perception of him as a kind of capitalist exploiting the community. So that's just a brief introduction to the San Francisco Fillmore, again, probably familiar to a lot of you. Let's now turn to New York. So this is Fillmore East, a little later in the period I'm talking about in 1970. Graham opened the Fillmore East on New York's Lower East Side in March 1968, at a moment when the counterculture was becoming increasingly invested in political radicalism and an expectation that rock would convey a radical message. In this political environment, the community was becoming less a welcoming site of friendly exploration and more an insular, embattled collective. This more defensive idea of the community was perhaps most dramatically embodied by a group called Up Against the Wall Motherfucker, or the Motherfuckers for short. And here is their logo from the underground magazine Rat Subterranean News, which you may know. So the East Village Other was the edgier alternative to the Village Voice, and then Rat Subterranean News was the edgier alternative to the East Village Other. So it's, it was about as sort of underground as you could get. And you see it says, "To live one must love, to love one must survive, to survive one must fight." It's signed Motherfuckers in small print. And some of you may know that the gentleman here is the guy from the Zigzag Rolling Papers logo. So you see that it's just a zigzag rolling paper man, but with a bandolier of ammunition that they've added to its shoulders, and then the expression "armed love" as a slogan. And here's another from the same publication. They love to publish these full-page manifestos, and so you can't read the text here. But you can see that there is what I assume is a 19th century political cartoon that they have added new text to. It says, "Paris burns, Henry returns, tonight St. Mark's Place," Mark's spelled with an X, as in, I suppose, both Carl and Groucho, depending which you like. Paris, of course, was the site of student riots in May and June of 1968. Henry was their code word. I don't remember where it comes from, but it was a code word for kind of like rioting and disorder. So if you saw this in the paper and knew the Motherfuckers lingo, this is inviting you to come to St. Mark's Place and cause trouble on that evening. So this gives you some idea of the tone of their organization. The Motherfuckers grew out of the New York radical arts collective Black Mask, and they saw themselves as urban guerrillas devoted to total revolution against almost every aspect of American bourgeois society. They frequently staged militant demonstrations and fought with police on the Lower East Side. Their most pointed attacks, however, were against elite culture. For example, the group hauled piles of trash from the Lower East Side to Lincoln Center during the 1968 garbage strike, describing the action as, quote, "a culture exchange, garbage for garbage," end quote. Cultural institutions like Lincoln Center, they argued, cheapened art by making it an aesthetic object divorced from political struggle. And it seemed to the Motherfuckers that Bill Graham was engaged in a similar endeavor, objectifying and profiting from the music of the counterculture. So I'll tell the story of the Motherfuckers' conflict with Graham succinctly, and then conclude by considering what it reveals about the idea of the rock community. The motherfuckers first set their sights on Graham in September 1968 when they approached him to demand the free use of the Fillmore East one night a week. Ben Morea, who was the motherfuckers' leader, argued that suburban kids were coming to the Fillmore in droves to get in on the psychedelic experience, while the kids who lived on the streets of the Lower East Side couldn't afford the price of a ticket. After some unpromising negotiations, the motherfuckers decided to take over the Fillmore themselves rather than wait for Graham's permission. On October 22nd, during a benefit for the Columbia Legal Defense Fund, the motherfuckers charged the stage. The New York Times reported, quote, "The performance reached a climax when nude performers unfurled a red banner across the stage. A mimeograph machine was then rolled up to the footlights, and leaflets were spewed out into the seats, proclaiming, 'Tonight the people return this theater to themselves. The seats belong to the people.'" In an onstage confrontation, Graham and a large group of radicals each stated their positions vociferously. According to several accounts, the motherfuckers threatened to burn the Fillmore down unless they were granted free use of a theater one night a week. Graham, in turn, announced, and this is another quote, that the Fillmore was his, and if they thought they were going to take it from him, they'd have to shoot him. Fortunately for Graham, nobody took him up on this challenge, and after a rancorous meeting the next week, a tentative agreement was reached to open the Fillmore for free on Wednesday nights. The first of these free nights took place on November 13th with music by local bands, The Group Image and The Fugs, who you might know. And here is a reminiscence about that. This is by, he was known as Tom Motherfucker at the time, has since changed his name to Osha Newman. And remember, so one of the members of this group remembers, "From our point of view, it was an enormous success. The theater was packed. It felt as if 2nd Avenue had tipped on its side and deposited its entire contents, animate and inanimate, in the theater. Discarded sandwiches, cigarette butts, cans, and bottles littered the carpets. Much wine was drunk, much dope was smoked. The program, such as it was, proceeded amidst a chorus of boasts, threats, brags, and rambling fantasies shouted out from every corner of the auditorium. Carpets were stained, seats were broken, toilets clogged and overflowed." In 1969, the motherfuckers remember this evening poetically as up to 1,200 people smoking, giving, dropping, stoned, and the music of hip culture, our culture, free culture, and we are together. What felt like freedom and togetherness to the motherfuckers, however, looked like chaos and destruction to Graham and his associates. So, remembering this same event in his autobiography, Graham complained that the first Wednesday night, people came in and brought their babies. They messed up the floor and peed on the walls and put their feet on the chairs and brought in their cooking utensils, so it became like an overnight shelter for the homeless, end quote.
Whoa.
3 more of these free nights followed before Graham finally decided to put an end to them. Tension came to a head on December 26 when the revolutionary Michigan quintet MC5 appeared at Fillmore East in a free concert sponsored by Elektra Records. Rolling Stone reported that after the show was announced, the motherfuckers phoned Elektra's office and threatened to burn the Fillmore to the ground unless they received free tickets. The Village Voice pointed out that insisting on free tickets to a show that was already free was more an inflammatory gesture of legitimate demand. On the night of the show, the theater filled to capacity, but a large crowd on the sidewalk, including some of the motherfuckers, continued to demand entry. According to Fillmore East manager Kip Cohen, "We insisted on order and kept our doors closed. The crowd was very angry. It wasn't an ego trip or a contest of wills. It was a demand for order on our premises because of our risks." Finally, violence erupted. Newman recalls, "The crowd chanted, yelled, and pushed. Bill himself stood in the doorway blocking the entrance. Suddenly, Israel, one of the Puerto Rican street kids who hung out with us, slashed a bicycle chain across his face. Blood began pouring from his nose. Bill fell back. At this point, the attack on Graham suddenly ceased. Cohen explained that a strange thing happened. The minute that they saw the blood on Bill's face, there was a strong reaction from the crowd, and these hundreds of people who had been swarming on top of him backed away. A lot of people were very disgusted, and it seemed to be a turning point in the whole thing." So that's the story of this confrontation. In the weeks that followed, the underground press debated the ethics of the motherfuckers' actions, and one of the key words in this conflict was community. What was it, and who could claim membership in it? The motherfuckers idealized the notion of the community. And here's a detail from another of, there we go. Here's a detail from another of these manifestos, and you see the middle line. So this is about the Fillmore. One night a week free at the Fillmore is only the beginning. They say in the middle, "We will take whatever it takes to strengthen our community in its struggle." As Rolling Stone pointed out at the time, however, the community is difficult to define in the present situation. Perhaps the most disparaging view was held by Elektra Records publicist Danny Fields, who remembered, "My favorite word, the community. They wanted to cook meals in there and have their babies make duty on the seats. These were really disgusting people. They were bearded and fat and earth-mothering Irish and angry and belligerent and old and ugly and losers. Many Lower East Side bohemians expressed a more ambivalent view, wishing that a commercial rock venue could become a community center, but uncertain how to achieve this goal, or questioning whether the motherfuckers were in fact the best representatives of the community. The underground paper Rat Subterranean News, which we've already met, described the free nights as events at which, without authority, panels, leaders, or programs, 500 of the most independent and alienated people in New York were trying to find a way to create a revolutionary community and free space to maintain it. Rolling Stone, in contrast, sided with Graham and criticized what it called the amorphous community, a coalition of various factions without any duly appointed leadership that seems to reject any collective responsibility. Some observers felt that the motherfuckers' violence and militancy were hurting the community by undermining more rational forms of protest. So a letter to Rat's editor asked, "Were you glad, crazies, when you saw Bill Graham's nose get broken with a chain? What's to become of us when the rest of us sit back, picking our noses, watching a bunch of strong-arm, bullying, loudmouth, infantile, elitist, ego-tripping fascists take over our movement?" Chains of insulting adjectives are a common thread throughout the sources. Other commentators pointed out that most residents of the larger Lower East Side community were in fact working-class Ukrainians and Puerto Ricans who had made the neighborhood their home long before hippies like the motherfuckers began to move in. The motherfuckers' rhetoric and actions had little or nothing to offer these groups. Virtually no one questioned the idea that Fillmore East, as opposed to City Hall or the New York Stock Exchange, was an appropriate site for a radical occupation in support of a self-proclaimed community. What made the motherfuckers' provocation at Fillmore East seem worthy of reasoned debate rather than outright condemnation or dismissal? I propose that many commentators saw the motherfuckers' actions as the logical extension of the ideas of community that Graham himself had worked to establish at the San Francisco Fillmore. If the San Francisco Fillmore offered free apples for all, why couldn't you cook at the Fillmore East? If toddlers are welcome at the original Fillmore, why not change diapers on the Fillmore East seats? If there was no separation between bands and audience, why would you pay to hear music? If people virtually lived at the Fillmore, why couldn't they actually live at the Fillmore East? In short, if a rock venue represented the boundaries of your community, why did you ever have to leave? The conventional capitalist answer that the hall's availability depended on Graham's willingness to take financial risks and patrons' willingness to compensate him threatened to expose the entire vision of rock as community as merely a cynical commercial production. Graham, who had helped to create this vision, found himself disparaged by people who took it to extremes. When Graham announced in 1971 that he was closing both Fillmores, he explained that one reason was that he was tired of the abuse he had received in what he called the role of antichrist of the underground. In conclusion, what I hope to have suggested is that the rock community of the 1960s was a slippery social formation, held together only tenuously by the shifting aims and values of its members. To point this out isn't, I don't think, to minimize the very real moments of communal ecstasy and warm togetherness that many people experienced at both Fillmores, but rather to suggest that such moments were not inherent to rock as a cultural form, but rather required cooperation and compromise. It's worthwhile to consider how rock's utopian sense of community was created, how it sometimes failed, and how we might grasp it again. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Michael.
I am passing out a lobby card. I'm really not going to say anything about it because I had to trim 1,000 words from my talk, and so this will be the 1,000 words, but it does put you in the spirit of what I'm talking about today. So feel free to, just pass it around, that's fine. And if you read the abstract, you saw this epigram, and I'll read it to you now and take you on a somewhat serpentine journey that I think will make sense. I hope so. But the epigraph is this. It's from Brian Eno. Methyl octene carbonate evokes the smell of violets and motorcycles. That's an actual olfactory truth. So as horse travel changed into car travel in the early 20th century, these new cars needed stables of their own. and they were often called motor houses, which made sense. Later, the term garage took over, and in the mid-1950s, by the mid-1950s, we'll say, a few things had happened. First, these garages, these motor houses, were increasingly attached to suburban homes. Second, they got concrete floors. Third, the cars actually began to be parked more outside in the driveway, partly for convenience and partly for display. And finally, this space became a particularly male environment in the culture. So the content by the mid-1950s of garages was essentially metal and grease and testosterone. That was sort of the vibe of garages. Now, just as teenage boys found in automobiles a threshold into manhood, they found in the mid-1960s, or the early 1960s, excuse me, another threshold, and that was becoming part of a band. And the nexus of both things, the automobile and the bands, became the garage. A lot has been said by me and other people about garage bands and garage rock. Suffice it to say, you didn't have to be a band rehearsing in a garage to create garage rock. It was neither necessary nor sufficient that you play in a garage. Does that make sense? Garage rock is really a phenomenon, I think, that comes out of, as the Clash said, garage land. We are a garage band. We come from garage land. That is this sort of rough, motor-borne domain of the garage itself, which nurtured this species of rock that relied on electric distortion to mimic the sound of engines. I'll just quote this from Marshall McLuhan in 1964 because it's so beautifully said, as it often is from his mouth. Quote, all the rhinos and hippos, not hippies, all the rhinos and hippos and elephants in the world, if gathered in one city, could not begin to create the menace and explosive intensity of the hourly and daily experience of the internal combustion engine with all its power and explosive violence, end quote. Garage rock arose from that new truth. Now, by the time he said that, souped up cars, hot rods, dragsters, so on, were emblems of autonomy, as you know, and power. It permeated teenage culture. And rock songs fetishized hot rods and dragsters. Ronnie and the Daytona's GTO, for example, a hymn of praise to that particular car, which is going to shut him down, right? And some songs glorified the pseudo-heroic danger of hot rods and racing. Jan and Dean's Dead Man's Curve. But above all, the Beach Boys linked the idyllic spectacle of surfing and drag racing. Songs, these braggy machismo songs like Little Deuce Coupe and 409 and Shut Down and so on. Now, surf music and hot rod music were pretty much the same thing. In at least this respect, they mimicked the sound of engines and the nervousness, I suppose, of surfing with this sound in the guitar, low, rapid, repeated notes in the electric guitars. But it took pre-recorded sound effects to fully convert the one style surf into the hot rod style. So let me give you an example here. Johnny Fortune's Dragster, 1963. It starts with hot rod racing sounds that just return throughout the song, but the plunky plunk guitar sounds just like surf music. And so, what do I need to work on here? Oh, okay. Here's that example. This is X here. Okay. Here we go. All right. Wave sounds there instead of tracking We've got whole albums of dragster music, hot rod music, just instrumentals. I guess I'll send it around to you. And here's another boss drag at the beach. Of course. So, a few records at this time were including sounds of the dragster's cousin, the motorcycle. Although motorcycles were usually stored in the garage, if they were, of course, they didn't occupy that much space. There was room enough for a band. And the important thing with motorcycles was they just put out into public view and unmuffled audio space the engine sound and look, and it had all that great solo bravado to it. Motorcycle clubs and gangs, you know, had proliferated right after World War II especially, and during the rock and roll era of 1950s. But by 1964, again, records with actual motorcycle sound effects in the mix were big hits. Beach Boys' Little Honda, and of course the Shangri-La's Leader of the Pack. Now, the sonic parallel to these engine sound effects was guitar distortion. I published elsewhere in the book I showed you before a history of electric guitar distortion, going back to Bubber Miley and this growling in trumpets and boot saxophone playing, and then guitar distortion that involved damage to the speaker cones and the manipulation of tubes in the back. But as these instrumental rock recordings proliferated, they increasingly relied on novelty effects. And one of the best was fuzz boxes or some kind of fuzz device to create this buzzy sound. Well, I say buzzy sound because one of the first was the Ventures 2,000-pound beat, 1962. And Jimmy Gordon's Buzz, that's B-U and 7 Z's after it, okay, 1963. But of course, fuzz tone really entered the sonic mainstream probably best through the opening of Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction, 1965. Now, everyone knew what this distorted sound conveyed, and that was dissatisfaction. I'm quoting here from three record producers, Bob Rock first, quote, "Distortion is an attitude thing." Don Gaiman wrote, "Distortion is the sound of adolescence. It's anger. It's out of control." And Tom Werman, he says, "Distortion is equivalent to grinding your teeth. It's anger. It's a rude sound." So guitar distortion might be noise, but it has a meaning. It's the friction of exertion and struggle. So, when do we first encounter the explicit triangulation of fuzz, tone, aggression, and engine sounds on record? Well, it probably came with one of the earliest hot rod records, the Vets LP Rev Up 1963. Tracks like Superstock Vet and Chevy Scarfer and Happy Ho Daddy, to name a few. You have the fuzz guitar clearly mimicking these dragster sounds through every track. But listen to this one. This is Devil Driver from that album. And you can hear them crossfade this sliding low fuzz tone guitar with the sound of a hot rod recording itself. It's quite remarkable. That was a blip on the sonic radar screen. It remained for one particular track to put the association and this triangulation of fuzz and aggression and engine sounds into the broad public view, and that's Davy Allen and the Arrows blues theme from the 1966 film Wild Angels. That also gets that around. This track actually, I believe, was in the top 40 for 17 weeks. It opens with motorcycles revving up, followed by this recurring riff that sounds to me like a tinny sort of rapid permutation of motorcycle gear shifting. And that's the way I'm hearing it anyway. Let me play you this. All right. I was 10 years old when that came out, and I remember being struck by this connection sonically, which was new to me, of hearing the motorcycle, and then this fuzz tone, and there was some commonality there, a transition, an associative power to it. This same kind of thing happens even more in Wild Angels Volume 2. It's just the second soundtrack album, follow-up, because the first one was such a hit, and I'll send these around here too. And then another follow-up, Roger Corman's The Devil's Angels.
All right, John.
So yeah. Yeah, this is a great soundtrack. And so 1967, now our celebratory year here, as it opened, what was once a sonic novelty had become a new norm. And for me, the best example is in January 1967, Popular Electronics, which for years had been devoted to showing people how to eliminate distortion from recordings and sound reproduction, they published an article that opened this way, quote, "As you listen to rock and roll by the big-time performers, do you often wonder how they can get that fuzzy, raspy, piercing sound from an electric guitar while non-professional groups sound distinctively small-time?" And then it goes on to say, it show you how you could build for $3 a fuzz box that would make your guitar sound as if it were, quote, tearing your speaker to shreds. All right. So, by now, you might be asking, what does all this have to do with the Summer of Love? And the answer is simply, that summer had its B-side. The Summer of Love essentially began as a committee-written public relations proposal for the Haight-Ashbury, as you know, largely designed to sell bus tickets and reduce storefront inventories in the Haight. But the summer of 1967 was largely a summer of rage, anger, protests, marches, and havoc, actually. The counterculture that we celebrate in the summer of 1967 was about countering, which meant friction and abrasion. And angry motoric guitar distortion was much of its sonic accompaniment. Remember, anywhere hippies were in 67, motorcycle gangs were too. I can tell you stories. But the Hells Angels volunteered at the Human Bee Inn that January. They cruised the Haight like surrogate cops. They partied at Kesey's acid tests and stayed close to the Grateful Dead, both socially and iconographically, I should say. They distributed and they maintained equipment for rock bands. They caravanned performers and patrons to rock festivals where they also, quote unquote, policed the crowds. Their images populated the posters and the underground comics that were then coming into vogue. And consider this vivid overlap. In 1967, a Hells Angel organized and managed a new band, so noisy, they're often called the first heavy metal band. But they took their name from one of Owsley Stanley's most popular brands of LSD, Blue Cheer. Their first single, Summertime Blues. Okay. Now, here's another example. The band or musical event of the Summer of Love was the Monterey Pop Festival in June. What is it most remembered for? I think it's the American debut of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, led by a Harley-riding virtuoso who had developed a pseudo-Doppler effect sound on his guitar. And remember, his 7-song set begins with Killing Floor, and it ends with Wild Thing. And listen how Wild Thing starts. He uses fuzz tone and the whammy bar to create as blatant an imitation of motorcycle sounds as you can imagine. Check this out. This is the opening of Wild Thing. Song, he lit his guitar on fire and he flogged the speaker cabinets with its remnants. Summer of Love, indeed. Okay. So I return now to the epigraph. Methyl octene carbonate evokes the smell of violets and motorcycles. Chemically speaking, they give off the same scent, and that's my metaphor of choice for the summer of 1967. A single compound of both love and rage, one that in music was personified by both Donovan and Hendrix, by Scott McKenzie and Blue Cheer. Overall, of course, the rage won the year, as the Summer of Love turned into what the rest of the country called the Long Hot Summer. Soon, Detroit burned, protesters marched on the Pentagon, police cracked heads from Berkeley to Newark, the Haight-Ashbury held its funeral for the death of hippie, and the New York Times greeted 1968 with this headline, "The world bids adieu to a violent year." A few months after that headline, this graffiti appeared on a Parisian wall, and I'll end with this. "The more I make love, the more I want to make revolution." In other words, the mantra that flowed from 1967 was make love and war. At least war on the suburban establishment whose motor houses cradled its roaring soundtrack. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let us stay out of the way.
Well, thank you. Somehow you ended up with love and revolution.
Yes, I did that
Which
just
is-
for you.
We didn't, I don't know if we worked that out, but this is a summary of my long paper also, which I'm mainly going to read, just so that I stay true to the time frame, and also so that I keep track and get everything in here. So, in September of 1967, Patricia Coffin, an editor at Look magazine, wrote to avant-garde composer John Cage, asking Cage to provide a few words on the Beatles for an article Coffin was then writing. In her letter, which is now among Cage's papers at Northwestern University, she specifically asks Cage to address the Beatles' place in the world of serious music. She put serious in scare quotes there. Much has been said about the Beatles' creative development through incorporation of avant-garde music and other styles, and the transformation of their image from happy mop-tops to serious artists. My research draws on authors such as Ian MacDonald, Mark Lewison, Bernard Gendron, Ian Peel, and especially Michael Frontani's terrific book, The Beatles, Image in the Media, to summarize that history and to place Coffin's letter in context. It is well known that the Beatles were interested in experimental music by this time, and music by a number of composers, including Karlheinz Stockhausen and Luciano Berio. Stockhausen's face there on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, the only avant-garde composer to appear there, certainly reflects this fact. But according to Beatles associate and Paul McCartney biographer Barry Miles, it was John Cage who most influenced the band. A generation older than the Beatles, Cage had established a radical reputation and broadening circle of influence during the 1940s and 1950s by creating works that explored the results of indeterminacy or chance applied to music. Now, today, if anybody knows one thing about Cage, they know he's the guy who wrote 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, his so-called silent piece that really calls for performers to play nothing at all for that time frame, allowing the random sounds of whatever happens in the space to actually form the composition. Now, in truth, that particular work is in many ways an aberration for Cage, whose music was more typically a complexly managed sort of anarchy, took in the full range of acoustic and electronic sonorities, and could as likely be loud and lengthy as quiet and brief. McCartney was the first Beatle to encounter Cage's music and ideas, but he was quick to share his discoveries with his bandmates. In February 1967, as the group was putting the final touches on A Day in the Life during the Sgt. Pepper recording sessions, Cage's influence, as recounted by McCartney and Beatles producer George Martin, was manifested in the cataclysmic orchestral dissonances that demarcate the song's contrasting sections. Later in 1967, the radio noise heard at the end of I Am the Walrus echoed an approach Cage took in an earlier work, and Revolution 9, a year later from the White Album, embraced the sound of Cage's music most directly and expansively. John Lennon would ultimately go even further in his album-length avant-garde collaborations with Yoko Ono, who herself had previously studied and performed with Cage earlier in the 1960s. She knew Cage before she knew John Lennon or any of the Beatles. Since the Beatles' response to Cage and their music and words has been well established by others, and I get into that more in the full paper, in the presentation I'm going to limit my focus to Cage's response to the Beatles. Coffin's inquiry to Cage about the Beatles' place in the world of serious music, in fact, resulted in the only critical comment Cage ever made about the band. By considering Cage's statement in terms of his personal aesthetics and concerns, I will show that, though Cage was not really a fan of the Beatles' music, he recognized them as agents for social change, and the particular way he answered Coffin's question links Cage and the Beatles together in a broader community of revolutionary artists and thinkers. In Coffin's article, which was published in the January 9, 1968 issue of Look, she remarks that while the Beatles then remained exceedingly popular, quote, serious musicians dig them too. To support that point, she adds that John Cage applauds the revolutionary influence the Beatles have on our culture. Serious musicians, he feels, would do well to follow their example. Though this reference to Cage is intriguing as it's printed in the article, Cage's complete unparaphrased statement, as it appears in a carbon copy of his return letter to Coffin, also among his papers at Northwestern, provides a bit more clarity on his views. But at the same time, Cage's full response raises new questions about his awareness and perception of the Beatles. In the original letter, Cage writes, "My impression is that the Beatles' place is not so much in the world of serious music as it is in the world as revolution. I think that serious musicians would do well to follow their example in this respect. That is, I think that our proper business now, whether we're popular or serious, if we love mankind and the world he inhabits, is revolution." Given the Beatles' popularity and status as the period's preeminent artistic and social force, by many measures, such a comment invoking terms like love and revolution at that time is not all that striking on its own. But coming from Cage, who usually showed disinterest in popular music and disdain for any sort of commercial sound recording, this statement is surprising and confusing. For Cage, a groundbreaking composer of musical works designed to change significantly from performance to performance, the fixed form of the sound disc rendered that medium mainly antithetical to his creative philosophy. As early as 1950, Cage voiced contempt for records and maintained that position throughout his life. Considering that the Beatles gained their popularity and cultural eminence by creating and selling records, and that by the time of Cage's letter to Coffin, they had turned their full energies to the recording studio, what did Cage mean when he advised serious musicians to follow their example? Cage's unawareness and occasional criticism of popular music similarly raises questions about the meaning of his statement. In his book, Records Ruin the Landscape, David Grubbs illustrates what he calls Cage's willful ignorance toward popular music and culture, with stories of how in the 1960s, Cage did not recognize names like Chuck Berry or Bo Diddley when they were mentioned to him. Cage was proud of how, Cage was proud of how out of touch he was. The musician and artist Henry Flint is quoted recalling with dismay. Cage's unfamiliarity with popular music could be due to his aversion to records, but in a 1966 interview, he admits a purposeful avoidance of any music that has a steady beat. Though speaking mainly of jazz, Cage also criticizes Bach and rock music for their predictable rhythms and what he calls lethal measurement of time, though he does concede that rock's use of electronics makes it somewhat more appealing. As for Cage's awareness of the Beatles, there's no doubt he knew who they were due to the media's inescapable coverage of the band, as well as an indirect connection to them through Yoko Ono, who was personally acquainted with McCartney and Lennon by the time of Cage's letter to Coffin. Yoko's romantic relationship with John Lennon, of course, had not yet begun and wouldn't commence until May of 1968, but she had just entered the Beatles' social circle in London. Ono and Cage kept in touch with occasional correspondence, and Ono even procured for Cage some examples of Lennon and McCartney's original handwritten lyrics for an archive of musical notation Cage was then amassing, and I'm proud to say those are also at Northwestern. But there is no indication Cage listened to or was even familiar with the Beatles' music. In a letter written less than 2 weeks after his response to Coffin, Cage makes the mistake of referring to McCartney as John McCartney, an error hardly conceivable for anyone with even the vaguest interest in popular music and culture in 1967. Years later, even after Lennon and Ono were neighbors of Cage in New York, they lived in the same building, they had dinners together, and Cage helped Lennon with his immigration status. Cage admitted he had none of the Beatles' records. So if Cage did not listen to the Beatles or even pay them much attention, why did he think they were such an important revolutionary force? Cage may have had hardly any knowledge of popular music and culture, but he was acutely interested in Marshall McLuhan, another thread back to your paper, whose theories about media and electronic communications in many ways were manifested in the Beatles. For years, Cage had taken little interest in current events, but in the 1960s, he became troubled by war, violence, social unrest of the time, and began seeking possible solutions in books from a range of fields. Along with McLuhan, Cage's other key influences were Buckminster Fuller and Norman O. Brown. Out of these explorations, Cage professed becoming less interested about art and less concerned about art and music and more focused on improving the world overall. I think art's work is done, he asserted. We must turn our attention now, I think, to other things. Those things are social. From McLuhan's books, The Gutenberg Galaxy and Understanding Media, which were published in 1962 and 1964, respectively, Cage came to understand the electronic environment as an externalized nervous system for humanity, where everything happens simultaneously, there's no fixed point of view, and all cultures are connected. Cage marveled at the possibilities. Besides studying McLuhan's published writings, Cage communicated personally with McLuhan, and the two maintained a friendship and periodic correspondence for a number of years. Cage wrote of McLuhan in 1967, "Not a moment passes without my being influenced by him." McLuhan returned the compliment by including a series of Cage quotations in The Medium is the Massage, the 1967 illustrated pocket-sized book that brought McLuhan's ideas to an even wider and more diverse audience. Though Cage made only one serious statement about the Beatles, McLuhan referenced the group several times as exemplars of the monumental changes ushered in by networked electronic technology. As early as September 1964, just months after the Beatles' ascent to worldwide popularity, McLuhan, as reported in the Montreal Gazette, stunned an assembly of Canadian Conservative Party politicians by suggesting they could learn much from the Beatles, who are perfectly attuned to the electronic age which created them. McLuhan contended that the Beatles were part of a shift in society from the fixed viewpoint of individuals to the communal all-at-onceness of a global village. Quote from McLuhan, "There is about the Beatles something that is new and radical," he told the politicians, and continued, "The Beatles really do speak with the authority of the electronic age and tell us a great deal about the changing relation between government and the governed." In a similar vein, Michael Kramer, in his book, he notes that Ken Kesey, also 1964, very early, recognized the Beatles' power for communicating a message, but Kesey immediately was much more skeptical than McLuhan about whether this power could or would be harnessed. Speaking later in 1966, McLuhan cited the Beatles' use of past musical styles to demonstrate how electronic media allowed the retrieval of forgotten ideas, and in 1967 he said that the Beatles, through their music, were trying to tell us how we have changed and in what ways. In his 1969 book Counterblast, McLuhan says, "Bless the Beatles for reaffirming that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." The influential positions McLuhan and the Beatles each held in the new electronic age were further affirmed by the BBC's Our World television special, the first live international satellite broadcast on June 25, 1967, just a few weeks after the release of Sgt. Pepper. McLuhan appeared near the beginning of the program, providing commentary on the historical significance of the broadcast and speculated on the ways technology was reshaping the world. Later in the show, the Beatles played All You Need Is Love, composed especially for the occasion and televised as the group recorded the song. As described by Wilford Mellers, in terms not citing McLuhan, but plainly evoking his ethos, All You Need Is Love, in the ways it was created, introduced, and delivered to the world, is a song made possible only by electronic technology and the multiple media of the global village. It's possible that during one of Cage and McLuhan's visits with each other, they discussed the Beatles, but there's no record of that ever happening, and no mention of the band in the correspondence between Cage and McLuhan. But taking into account Cage's disinterest in records and popular music, his fascination with McLuhan's ideas, and McLuhan's recurrent references to the Beatles, it seems most likely that Cage's assessment of the Beatles was somehow based on McLuhan's perspective of the group, rather than on impressions of the band Cage formed himself. Though he did not mention McLuhan explicitly in his statement on the Beatles, The particular words Cage chose show some similarity to another text from around this time, providing a bit more evidence that Cage had McLuhan in mind when he responded to Coffin. Originally drafted in October 1966, nearly a year before his letter to Coffin, Cage's foreword to his 1967 book, A Year From Monday, gives a short overview of key influences on his recent thinking. This includes McLuhan's notion that, as summarized by Cage, electronic technology produced an extension of our brains to the world formerly outside of us. And then he urges, our proper work now, if we love mankind and the world we live in, is revolution, drawing a close parallel to part of his statement on the Beatles, which again was, I think that our proper business now, etc., if we love mankind and the world he inhabits, is revolution. In A Year From Monday, Cage does not refer to any specific artist he sees leading music or society toward revolution, nor does he make clear in this passage or anywhere else in his writings or statements what exactly he envisioned a revolution to be. But when prompted by Coffin, Cage may have reflected on what he heard of the Beatles from McLuhan and recognized the connection between McLuhan's views of the group and his own thoughts on how the changing world created new opportunities, new responsibilities for musicians. While Cage's statement appears to be rooted in McLuhan's ideas, Ono's enthusiasm for the Beatles may also have elevated Cage's awareness of the band and its artistic and social relevance. In a letter to Cage in February 1967, again, this is before she and Lennon were together, Ono describes her first meetings with Lennon and McCartney, and in passing, offers an opinion on why the Beatles had wider appeal than did some avant-garde music. Yoko says, if somebody asks me why the Beatles' music is more popular among teenagers than Stockhausen, I will say it's because their music is better. And the teenagers are wise to know about it. Now, it's unclear whether Ono meant specifically to criticize Stockhausen, who traveled in the same circles as Cage and Ono, or if she was using his name to represent serious experimental music in general. No matter the intention, it's possible her comment registered somehow with Cage and also factored into his statement on the Beatles. Now, my point is not at all to suggest that Cage was being disingenuous in his response to Coffin. Instead, what I'm proposing is that Cage's statement reflects his place in a network of ideas among an extended cross-influential community of artists and thinkers. As McLuhan drew on the Beatles to illustrate his theories, and the Beatles drew on Cage to develop their music, Cage drew on McLuhan to understand the dawning information age, which we didn't call it yet then, and to imagine how artists might contribute constructively. Without this backdrop, Cage's remark, as paraphrased in Coffin's article and quoted in many publications, this thing gets quoted all the time without this context, it can easily be misinterpreted as no more than the admiring words of yet another Beatles fan. By tracing the lines of awareness, interest, and influence among Cage and the Beatles, as well as Ono and especially McLuhan, a fuller, more complex understanding emerges. Fundamentally, Cage may have been saying more about his esteem for McLuhan than about his appreciation for the Beatles, but his statement, at a point of intersecting responses to popular culture, transformative technology, and social change, ultimately reaffirms the Beatles' broad effect on the music, ideas, and hopes that shaped the 1960s. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. And we will take questions now, which you can address either to the group or to an individual. Questions, comments? Yes.
I have a question for the talk on the garage band.
Oh, sure.
Do you think that the popularity of that music generated the popularity of the Ramones?
Oh, yeah. And well, at least the Ramones and early pub groups, to use that sort of generic phrase, was responding to 60s garage bands or one-hit wonders that were collated largely in the Nuggets collection. At least they term it in those ways. So, you know, there are things that we don't even think about much anymore, like Paul Revere and the Raiders, who actually were incredibly potent influence on the next generation, which would include the Ramones. So, yeah, that definitely, overtly, I'm saying.
Yeah.
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 Oh, I just wanted to make a comment about the Beatles and Barrage. So the Charlatans, George Hunter, who started the Charlatans, he was more or less a conceptual artist, really. And early on, he says that he started the Charlatans from two inspirations. One is his first kind of foray into music was electronic music. Electronic, played on non-instruments, traditional instruments. And the second thing was the Beatles. So relating that to San Francisco and music that came out of here. And the Charlatans are very much considered to be sort of a real founder, a pioneer, actually. The first band to emerge out of the hate scene. So, and they set a lot of the mores, musical and otherwise, for the San Francisco sound and San Francisco scene.
Well, I appreciate you linking it to San Francisco.
Sorry,
'cause I didn't do that. I thought, how did I do this? And I didn't think of that. No, that's great. And there's so much with Cage. I mean, as I said, we have the Cage archive at Northwestern. For many years, I was curating for that collection, and so his name comes up again and again, and it's that influence, and particularly in the Beatles, it's something that, I mean, his name comes to represent a lot. It wasn't only Cage, of course, but I didn't know that particular story. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is also for you. In the world of psychology, well, depending on who you read, some argue that nothing is an accident, right? Depending, right? Or as such. On Sgt. Pepper, the artists who created that, do you think that there was any intent in placing the image of Cage between Edgar Allan Poe and Aleister Crowley?
Do you?
Well, Cage is,
Isn't it W.C. Fields?
Cage is none.
Cage is not.
Cage is not on.
Oh, I thought he
No,
was.
Stockhausen.
Oh, Stockhausen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, same question. Yeah. So anyway.
Near W.C. Fields.
Yeah.
Yeah. The fact that Cage isn't there, I mean, that's too bad. That would strengthen what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But it shows, but it also acknowledges that, this is, even in that this great letter from Yoko, where she says that about, the Beatles are better than Stockhausen, which most people agree. But there, it's not even clear to me whether she's just throwing that name to represent experimental music in general.
Yeah.
Two quick questions for Michael. First of all, wonderful panel. I loved the way there are all kinds of fascinating interconnections between what y'all did, and so wonderful panel. Two quick questions for you. One is, I just finished plowing through the book Teen Beat Mayhem, if you know that one. It's a great big anthology, very much dedicated to Garage, which he defines as essentially a kind of, it's an interesting and sort of polemical, almost ideological argument about rough, rootsy garage music.
Yeah.
And what I was wondering is, one thing about your use of the automotive elements, all of that, he argues very strongly that it's a music that really doesn't have a great deal of studio intervention. The examples that you played seem to have a good bit of that, and I was just wondering if there is a tension there or not.
Well, in the realm of garage bands, garage rock, I mean, it's been a burgeoning scholarly field for the last 20 plus years, at least 20 plus years. And there are different takes on it, and I understand that point of view. I think that is talking about garage bands and the recordings they made, sometimes even made in garages, as far as that goes. But I'm taking a little bit of a contrary point of view, which is, let's talk about garage rock as rock that somehow seems to me integrally connected to engine sounds and metal and so on, which is not. I'm not even sure that I agree with that. I tend to speak in McLuhan-esque terms, which is I'm sending out probes, saying, think about it this way. Here's an angle of vision on it. But there is a lot of friendly discord on definitions of terms, particularly with this garage phenomenon, garage band / garage rock, which may have connection, may not. And I'm taking a very particular view of it in this paper, at least. Yeah. I don't know if that answers.
So I also had a comment or a question, maybe too. Has to do with the phylogeny of distortion. That there seem to be several different ways that people allude to the history of basically a fuzz tone coming into guitar. One of them is Dave Davies or Ray Davies, one or the other claiming that they slashed, the speaker cone and came up with that sound for.
And taped it together.
Yeah. And the other is Link Ray, just blowing out his speaker and creating that riff. And then you have this clear message that it may have happened much earlier. So it's interesting to see that that's something that probably arose in parallel several different ways, just as a way of taking the overdrive possible with playing through an amplifier, which basically has a speaker cone in it, and making it sound more aggressive.
Yeah, again, I was linking it here to engine sounds and made a connection there. But essentially, instrumental distortion of all kinds comes from vocal distortion. If you're moving a piano, I'm just saying that the sound. I think of Muddy Waters, when he says his opening singing, which is not the way the Rolling Stones sang it. I just want to make love to you. I don't be no slave. It's and the same thing in the gospel tradition. I played piano, believe it or not, in the new Sweet Home Church of God in Christ in the early '70s. I was one of maybe 3 white guys there, but I got so used to that as a form of expression and a form of showing exertion. So I'd say it's a vocal thing, which then comes into these other phenomena of brass instruments and woodwind instruments, saxophone in particular, and so on. But there's something special, I think, about the combustible engine being converted into electrical distortion. There's a power kind of hinge there, for me at least.
Yeah, well, since there's a bit of debate, I guess, about the origins of distortion and such, I wonder if the point could be made that there is a mistake in miking technique, because again, all this is new, amplifiers, microphones, and such, and the sensitivity of the diaphragm of the microphone. So I'm just wondering if somebody at some point made a mistake in their miking technique and they said, hey, this is good.
I think it's interesting that that you mentioned Muddy Waters, because really, if you draw parallels between the sound of automobiles and the sound of electric guitar, I think you have to go back to Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. And the transition from rural blues to urban blues was the transition of the sound of nature to the sound of the city, and that if we're looking for the origins, I think that would be the logical place.
Or what about Little Walter? You take a harmonica and shove the microphone into it, turn it up loud, it's an instrument, right?
For Patrick, one difference between well, at least the Fillmore West and the Fillmore East that I don't know if you did talk about, was that from what I remember, what I've read, the Fillmore East had seating, whereas the Fillmore West was open, was more of a ballroom.
Yeah,
and
right.
So how, maybe could you expand on that and how that kind of factors in these different understandings of community and relation to the music and different situations, which I've certainly read about, and how bands react to that in different ways.
Yeah, it's a good point. So Bill Graham takes over these places that have, they already exist. He didn't design them or build them. And so there's a sense in which, the Fillmore is a space where the Fillmore in San Francisco, the original one, you're right, the should have mentioned it was ballroom. So you're meant to move around the space. And you're meant to dancing is obviously. So there's a sense in which I think a group like the Motherfuckers. I'm not sure they put it this specifically, but I think it's almost like the fact that there are seats, even though it's not really Graham. I suppose Graham could have paid lots of money to have some of them removed or something like that. But there's something about that creates this artist versus audience distinction that's offensive to them, right? Where it's like you're paying to go to a movie or you're paying to go here. It's like Lincoln Center, right? Which I don't like either. So I think, I don't have much to add except for that's a great point. I think that's the architecture itself becomes part of the sort of propaganda against Graham in Fillmore East's case.
Yeah. I have another question for Patrick. Yeah. It's sort of and I love this sort of discussion of the engagement. I want to do 180.
Yeah.
And how Bill Graham uses mediation to advertise, and they're quite different. Obviously in San Francisco, we think of the posters. Very few posters made for the Fillmore East. What he has made are programs. And my sense, he plays to the New York theater. He's reaching out. It's a different type of community out. He's not reaching out to the counterculture. He's sort of reaching out to New York traditions of theater and performance. And that doesn't work. The posters aren't there. But there, and I know of no programs for
the Fillmore.
For the West. I can't think of anything.
Postcards, but
right. But
I think they may exist for things like the San Francisco Mime Troupe or Eldridge Cleaver, but I'm not sure. But rock shows would have had programs.
But Graham was trying to out Family Dog the Family Dog too.
Oh yeah.
So that made
the idea of seats now also. Rock music has become commercial.
Right.
And I think he could sell seats.
And they were reserved seats.
Yeah, because in fact, when the Fillmore first started, they were dances.
Yeah.
And
no, I really like this idea that because the seats are important in the discussion. The Motherfuckers aren't just like making a mess; they're like befouling the seats, right? By having their babies sit on those. Yeah, you're right. It's a great point. There's something about seats create a sense of formality that makes it all the more offensive that they're in there, sort of messing the place up. Yeah.
There's another big difference between the Fillmore East and the others, and that is how the light show is projected. The Fillmore East was back projected, and so the Joshua Light Show is actually often the most touted, but it was really the one presented as a separate art form, where the West Coast was forward projected across the environment, and it was an immersive, but you couldn't distinguish it. You have much more the kind of melding where. And it's interesting, I think that's what was more the intention of the light show, but we've lionized the Joshua as the performance rather than the immersive environment. And that was, I think, purely due to the layout of the Fillmore East vis-a-vis the
dance. It's also on the continuum, I think, even at the original Fillmore, where that's one of the comparisons that people often made between the San Francisco Fillmore and the Avalon Ballroom, that they'd have the light, you're right, they'd have a light show projected, so it would sort of, at the Avalon Ballroom, it would simply cover up the band. It would be, blobs would be floating on Grace Slick's head, and that was just part of the experience. Whereas, Graham would make sure, well, you can do that, but we're going to have like a little spotlight here, or we're going to maybe lift it up a little bit so you can see. So there's a sense in which Graham still wants it to be a show where you can see the players, and that Chet Helms was much more into creating this sort of sensory overload. Yeah.
But Graham came from theater.
Yes, that's right.
In New York.
And that stage was input.
But it's also worth remembering the Joshua Light Show is on staff and on salary. It's all part of that more controlled environment where, and it's also true that Fillmore East, he had his own PA. He didn't allow bands to bring in full PAs, correct?
I believe that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and that's also a huge contrast with the West Coast where you've got all the different light show artists and everybody brings their own equipment. Yada yada yada. So it all speaks to that kind of control that you're describing.
It's remarkable. It's only a year apart. How different it is.
Yeah. And something that we haven't, I think, addressed at all at this conference is the conflict that was going on in San Francisco, which was kind of the motherfuckers issue turned on its back. That the city was pressuring the ballrooms because they didn't have dance permits.
Right.
They weren't really supposed to be having people dance, and that reached its apex with the Straight Theater, which had these dance lessons, which the Grateful Dead would be the music for it. So.
Yeah, and Graham would bill his shows as concert dances, which I'm not sure of the legal ramifications of that, but it was specifically because calling it that somehow allowed him to skirt the,
Exactly.
which then of course lead, on the one hand it's a legal trick, on the other hand it does lead to the perception that this is not simply a dance, it's a concert where you watch, right? So it's part of that shift, maybe.
All right. Well, thank you all, gentlemen. This
Thank
was
you.